What happens when the global insurance provider becomes a source of risk? Welcome to the call. I'm Jay Sapsford. For nearly 80 years, America provided open markets, safe investments, and security on the high seas. For allies, these public goods served as an insurance policy against a world full of risk. In return, the U.S. got cheap loans and the right to set the rules for international engagement. Now the U.S. is asking for more, a lot more, for that insurance. So allies are left to wonder, what will be the U.S. role in this chaotic new era? Joining us now is Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics and the recent author of The New Economic Geography, a provocative piece in foreign affairs. Adam, welcome to the call.
Thanks so much for having me, Jay. Glad to be with the Chamber Group.
Now, you open your piece with a striking line: the post-American world economy has arrived. What did you mean by that, and how did we get here?
I think of the post-American world economy, Jay, as you nicely summarized, a world in which it is not the U.S. setting the terms of the order, not because it ceased to be powerful, but because it ceased to choose to do so. And these terms of the order were always not a question of diktat. They were a question of getting companies, investors, households, and governments to voluntarily participate, sometimes grudgingly, but ultimately voluntarily. So as you said, the U.S. provided, with its in-depth treasury markets, with its stable currency, with its open trade, with its rule of law, with its military on the seas, all kinds of ways to ensure global commerce. And then they backed off that under Biden and Trump's first terms and explicitly have backed away from doing that, saying they want to renegotiate the deal in Trump's second term.
All right, to run with that insurance metaphor just a bit further, when risks go up, and our world is clearly more risky than it used to be, doesn't it make sense to be charging more for premiums?
They are. Absolutely. That's what makes insurance a profitable, reasonable business. But there are three things that I think are left out by that perception. The first is simply that, unlike, say, a property casualty insurer assuring against wildfires or flood risk, when the U.S. insures against risk as a government, it actually changes the risks that are out there. When the U.S. extends, for example, its security umbrella to Eastern Europe, or the U.S. says we're going to protect intellectual property rights. The second point is that there is a difference between, yes, you've got to raise your premium in some amount that your clients, your customers think, okay, it's a little more, but it's worth it, versus you extract maximum premium and keep threatening to withdraw coverage. And that's not necessarily worth it for your customers. And that's ultimately what this is about, and why I'm glad to engage with the Chamber audience, because businesses and investors, as well as foreign governments, have agency. They don't have to accept the offer that the U.S. makes if the offer the U.S. makes is unreasonable. And then the third point, and when I say U.S., I mean the U.S. government. And the third point, which is implicit in what you say about the insurance metaphor, which is absolutely right, is the Trump administration, and frankly, the Biden administration before it, have created this sense of overt risk that is not correct. That's not to say China isn't a national security threat. There aren't other things going on. Russia isn't doing things. It's to say that the focus on getting more money out of allies and other countries doesn't address those risks, and many of those risks are exaggerated or can be dealt with through non-economic means. There's no loss to continuing to provide the insurance. So yes, a repricing of risk in a reasonable way would be perfectly reasonable. The way they're doing it now is self-defeating, I think, for the world economy. There are opportunities, there are countries who will gain, but I think on balance, it's a bad move to get out of the insurance business, which was very profitable.
I'm going to squeeze in a member question here. How do we balance this global insurance role with tariff increases as a foreign policy tool?
Tariff increases as a foreign policy tool, we can debate their effectiveness and their net cost benefits, but they should be highly targeted. They should be about things like, we are putting sanctions on Russia because of the invasion of Ukraine, or we are trying to limit China's access to the highest end semiconductor chips, or we are trying to promote one specific industry in the U.S. But across the board tariffs that make no exceptions for individual countries' relationships with the U.S., that are not rules-based, that are trying to discourage trade or maximize tax revenue at the expense of other commercial activities, including American companies that import, these are all bad ideas. So again, on the surface, you can come up with something. And it's absolutely right that if there's one thing neoliberal or mainstream economists, which I include myself, missed, it was the dangers of concentration risk. That, if you get all the world's semiconductors from one spot in Taiwan or all the world's rare earth magnets from China, that is a risk. But if you look at that in an objective way, that's a very small handful of specific things to deal with, and best dealt with by building relationships in other economies and with allies, not with the tariffs.
Now, Adam, we're throwing up a chart showing the size of the U.S. debt market, which at roughly $60 trillion is nearly 40% of the world total. Now, this market has been the default savings vehicle for the world, as you point out in your piece. How do the shifting dynamics you describe affect this market, and what does it mean for the U.S. role as a safe haven?
Thank you for the question, Jay, as well as your kind characterization. And you're absolutely right. The U.S. share is actually, in terms of influence and importance of the Treasury and debt market, is actually bigger because we're also the most liquid market, the most transparent, the deepest. And so even the 39%, which I think was on your slide, understates the importance. So many other things get priced off of it. So the question is, does the U.S. ever undermine that? Is there any advantage to trying to set up a gatekeeping role on that? And is there an alternative? And the answers are, first, there's no advantage to undermining it. But unfortunately, as my colleague Morris Obstfeld at Peterson Institute, a former IMF chief economist, has argued, there's a whole set of ways in which the Trump administration is to some degree undermining it. The tariffs, not so much because of their direct impact, but because of the uncertainty they create and the arbitrary access in and out. But as I would argue, the lax fiscal policies, the pressures on the Federal Reserve independence, the demands and interferences in investment, these are all things that undermine, to some degree, the U.S. role. And we see that not in some huge decline of the dollar, which goes to the no alternative point. It's not that the dollar suddenly become worthless or ceases to become a reserve currency. But what we've seen is when there's bad news, the dollar behaves since April Fool's Liberation Day on April 2nd this year, the dollar repeatedly acts like an emerging market. Interest rates go up when the dollar goes down, as opposed to interest rates and the dollar moving together. So it's a mess. It doesn't mean that the U.S. loses status overnight, but it ultimately, again, goes back to that issue of agency. If you're a Chinese saver or investor, if you're a European, and you are worried that the U.S. government can intervene in an arbitrary way, such that your national identity plays a key role in whether you're going to be taxed in a different way on Treasury holdings or U.S. dollar holdings, whether you're going to be able to get in and out in a liquid way. And not that much has happened yet, but the Treasury Undersecretary Bessent and the White House have repeatedly floated ideas about we were going to tax sovereign wealth funds. That was in the original version of the One Big Beautiful Bill. We were going to make it harder for Chinese people or Chinese investors to get in and out of U.S. assets. We were going to do things to make sure the dollar value goes down. They also are doing things like the stablecoin proposals, which potentially increase demand at the short end of Treasury. So it's not all one way. But the thing is, for the 80 years we were talking about, roughly, none of that was in question except for a brief period in the 70s. And what we saw was during that brief period in the 70s, inflation was higher in the US influence was down, volatility was higher, and treasuries were less attractive. That's when you start getting the euro dollar market and all these alternatives coming up. So it's not 0-1. It's not the dollar goes away. But what we do see, even in pension funds, in sovereign wealth funds, and long-term investors and central bank reserve managers, is people are spending money on hedging risk from the dollar and from treasuries, whereas for most of the last 80 years, again, with an exception of a period in the 70s and the early 80s, that we haven't seen before. And that's a warning indicator, I think.
Well, that tees up another question from one of our members. The world has to park its savings somewhere. Is gold the answer?
I think gold is the result, but not the answer. I think it's a very fair question from your member. But I think we're moving into a world where we've already moved, but it's becoming more so, where what are used to be called alternative assets are much more important and be taken much more seriously by investors, not just private individuals, but central banks, reserve managers, large funds. So gold, which has no particular intrinsic value, I think continues to secularly gain. Various crypto assets like Bitcoin, I think, have a level of interest and investment that is, frankly, again, out of whack with any fundamentals, but it reflects this desire for alternatives. I think there are a number of market-oriented, relatively stable, smaller economies with their currencies that are going to get overvalued. So Norway, New Zealand, Singapore, Switzerland, and then some of the others like potentially Japan or UK, they will see inflows. And again, it's not the end of the world, but just in general, a more insecure world, partly for national security reasons and partly because of the behaviors of the US government, is going to be a world where people keep more money at home, so are less diversified, and where people and investors resort more to alternative assets, which essentially are uncorrelated with fundamentals. That's the reason they're alternative. And so basically they're a fear play. And as long as there's fear, they have value. And then when they don't have fear, they don't have value.
Now, to elucidate your thesis here, I wonder if we might pick one ally. We wrote extensively in your piece about the role of Japan in all of this. I wonder how
Yeah.
you see the impact on Japan of this shift in the U.S. emphasis on, or it's this demand for more premiums in this insurance policy.
It's really interesting, Jay, to think about this. And I've been trying to figure out a way to write it in a more systematic way. But essentially, what's at work is what I call the irony of the alliances, that those countries that are most dependent on the US in a combined security and economic sense, so Japan, South Korea, the UK, Canada, despite the current political frictions, at the top of the list, they have the closest relationships with the US, the most interdependence with the US, and so they are the ones who really have no alternative. So if the insurance goes away, or the insurance premium triples for less coverage, they have to buy it. They have no choice. And we're seeing this right now with Japan. And partly it is a choice by Japan. The new prime minister, Ms. Takaichi, represents an even more hawkish, meaning assertive foreign policy concerned about national security threats from China and North Korea than Prime Minister Abe, who I used to advise a bit. Um, and and that's fine. The Japanese people have the right to do that, obviously. And there are a lot of people, I think, on Capitol Hill who feel Japan has been an increasingly good national security ally over the last several years, engaging in what's called the Quad, engaging in more exercises that potentially are conflictual or at least standing up to China, more coordination, more spending. So, and to be fair to the Trump administration, in general, one side effect of their approach is they have gotten more defense spending out of a number of allies, including Japan, but also Germany and some others. Um, and so, but then Japan on the economic side, which is what we're talking about here, and for your members, is essentially doing an extended Nippon Steel strategy, which is putting money into the U.S. into things that are not even necessarily high return, and saying we're willing to sacrifice market access and sales in China and some other places for the sake of very tight national security ties with the US. And the issue for the US then is, do you just sort of say, great, we can get the maximum insurance premium out of these people and we could take them for granted? Or do you say, okay, they're growing with us. Their economy is more dependent on ours. So should they become a preferred provider of this, that, and the other? Should they be treated as in our market as essentially the same as Americans? In our defense industrial base is essentially the same as Americans. And that's what Japan was going for, frankly. But both under Biden and under Trump, there's been a reluctance to take advantage of that in the good sense of trying to build out deepen relationship. It's been more extractive. And if you're extractive, even if it's Japan, at some point, the longer term goes away from the US.
Now, you're saying that this policy shift may have less of an impact on China than it has on some of our close allies like Japan. Is that because China's further down the road towards, for lack of a better term, self-insuring here in this readjustment of the global order?
It's a really good question. I think there are a number of reasons why it has less impact on China. One is not just so much self-insurance, but just that they are less dependent on the US. As I argued in an earlier piece this year ahead of the US-China battles in April, May, June, China has at the moment, not permanently, but at the moment has escalation dominance, meaning if the US tries to put pressure on them, China can always up them in terms of pressure. Because in the end, if the US cuts off China, for the most part, they lose money, which is unfortunate, but they don't lose something they can't replace. They can get money elsewhere. The US has this specific set of vulnerabilities that if China cuts us off, we can't replace it quickly or easily. So the key piece of strategy shouldn't be tariffs or conflict with China. It should be wholeheartedly trying to make sure we've got alternative sourcing, whether domestic or allied, for rare earths, for semiconductors, for certain specialty pharmaceutical products and inputs. And again, it's an important list, but it's a finite list, and that's how you deal with it. So
And as a
China is worse off in this world, but they're not weak in this world. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to let you finish your point here. And as a final series of questions, let me ask you something from the horizon, which is a deck of geopolitical questions that we on the Global Intelligence Desk use to engage with our members. Are we entering an era of constrained U.S. dominance? And by that, I mean, can the U.S. afford not to raise premiums given all of the challenges? I mean, we're spending now more on our debt service than we are on defense at a time when demands to raise defense spending are greater than ever. Just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I mean, at some point I want to see all 9 of those questions and not so much answer them, but read them. But I mean, it's a great exercise, Jay, with your members. I think in terms of the US having constrained dominance is another place where the Trump administration is making a mistake. Because the US, short of these very specific things that China dominates production of, which we can, in a finite length of time, replace, um, the US isn't that vulnerable. The government is making all these claims that because we have trade deficits or because China is exporting a lot of medium to low end semiconductors or because there is increased spending problems in our fiscal society, we are weakening. And this is similar to Nixon and Kissinger in the 70s. And I think it's a complex set of views that echoes in various ways, where they went into the negotiations coming out of Vietnam with China, with Russia, believing very strongly the US was in decline and in terminal danger. And so they had to do détente to make accommodations. But it turned out ex post, as Reagan and then Bush showed, that the US was actually stronger than they thought. And so ultimately, when we say as you mentioned, I think it's the Ferguson test, are you paying more on interest rates than you are on defense? Well, that's actually easy to fix. Raise some taxes, cut some spending. This is a totally self-made problem in Washington because of bad governance. There is no economic constraint. The kinds of consolidation we would have to do to get us on a decent, sustainable fiscal path are quite achievable. They're in the order of 2 to 3% of GDP a year, which then fades out over time and when you get on the right path, because then your interest rates start to come down and your interest payments start to come down. This is eminently doable, and even if certain taxes, including tariffs, are badly designed or distortionary, as a general tax level, the US remains one of the lowest tax shares of GDP. So if you did it right and pretty much all economists agree, for the most part, on what right would mean, and what the chamber writes about it, for the most part, I agree with. Again, specific differences, but basically I agree. You can do this.
Right. Well, the chamber has a lot to say about taxes, as you note, but we also hope to have in the weeks and months ahead some folks from the Trump administration on to give them a chance to respond. But for now, let me just note that every now and then somebody writes a piece that really crystallizes the moment. Congratulations on having done so in your foreign affairs piece, Adam. It really was wonderful. Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Jay, and thanks to the Chamber Global Intelligence.
All right, our audience has gotten their shot of informational espresso and is ready to tackle the day. If you want more on the horizon, please contact the Global Intelligence Desk. Missed a live episode? Catch the replay on our website, LinkedIn, or on YouTube. You can also listen to the call's podcast edition on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you to our members for joining us today. This has been The Call, brought to you by the Global Intelligence Desk, asking the right questions to navigate uncertain times.